Hello, my name is Blaise Ross, and I'm going to do my best to teach you some of the rudimentary basics of reading poetry. I've been doing this for a while, on and off, and I sort of know what I'm doing. I'm not an expert, but I'm better than most people. So, one of the first things you have to realize about poetry in order to speak it well is the lack of rules. In poetry, there are no rules that have not been broken, and if there is a rule that has not been broken, then you might want to consider breaking it, just because that's what poetry is. One of the things that makes poetry difficult to read is punctuation. This is part of the no rules part thing, but there's sort of a split in the community as to whether or not you should use traditional punctuation versus poetry versus punctuation for breath marks and emphasis, things like that. Much more intuitive punctuation. So, if you look at this poem right here, this is The Misty Mountains Cold by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you look at this stanza in particular, on silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars, on crowns they hung the dragon fire, on twisted wire they meshed the light of moon and sun. And you see, the punctuation is actually what marks it out, not the line breaks, which is a confusing thing. That is what the verse actually looks or should be read like. On silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars. On crowns they hung the dragon fire. On twisted wire they meshed the light of moon and sun. However, the rhyming might not be on that scheme. It could be like this, strung, so your rhyme is actually on the line, but not how you're saying it. So you have strung, hung, wire, sun. So strung and hung rhyme, but they're not. It's not by punctuation. It's by lining. So one of the most to be good at reading poetry, you need to do one thing more than anything else. If you do this thing, you will become much better. You have to read the entire poem and understand it. Understand how it works. Because it changes. Sometimes it changes in the middle of a sentence. And when you're reading it, you don't have time to look at it and say, oh, something just changed if this is your first time reading it and you're trying to actually recite it. So, read the poem first, understand the whole thing before you try to actually speak it. Now, this is an example of a very good recitation of the poem Forgetfulness by Billy Collins.
Forgetfulness by Billy Collins. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one that you have never read, never even heard of.
So you'll notice here his tone of voice is very, very well connected to the tone of the entire poem. He's using a sort of dull dreariness that meshes very nicely with the contents of the poem.
As if
You'll also notice that he's actually going according to the exact punctuation. So he's not messing with anything there. That's
One by one,
normal.
the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain.
And notice here, he put a space right there, which isn't in the poem, but adds a lot. So those are the things you need to look for when you're shoo, 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 shoo. Those are the sort of things you need to look for when you're proofreading the poem.
To a remote fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye and watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you
Another pause there.
memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps.
Notice his questioning. He's gone from stating to questioning, which isn't explicitly stated anywhere in the text. There's no question marks, but the tone changes in the poem, and it's reflected here. You need to be looking for things like that.
The address of an uncle? The capital of Paraguay. What?
Notice how he lists, instead of a state flower perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay, he's doing a state flower perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. He's altering each item in the list so it sounds different and contributes in its own way. If you just list, if there's a list and you just list it out without giving each item its own feeling, you'll end up being incredibly boring.
Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, or even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen.
Notice the emphasis on the word spleen, which is there to be sort of a confuser, or the word there is meant to catch your attention and be off. And if you just said, in some obscure corner of your spleen, it wouldn't have quite the punch. So, if you'll notice,
Your corner of your spleen.
he gives spleen a bit more emphasis to catch the point and push it.
It has drifted off down a dark, mythological river, whose name begins with an L as far as you can recall. On your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have even forgotten how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem you used to know by heart.
So that is Forgetfulness by Billy Collins. Now, this right here is by this is the poem The City Limits by A.R. Amanz. It is read by Christian Wyman, who is an absolutely fantastic narrator. I am nowhere near as good as he is, but listen to how he does this poem. It's incredibly good.
When you consider the radiance,
Notice the pause right there. When you consider the radiance.
that it does not withhold itself, but pours its abundance without selection into every nook or cranny, not overhung or hidden.
And he's really, what he does that's so impressive is that he really picks out the rhythm in the poem in ways that you, unless you're listening to him or you're really good yourself, can be really hard to pick out.
When you consider that birds' bones make no awful noise against the light, but lie low in the light.
That line right there is just incredibly well done. And he ends almost on a period there, even though there is no period there in the poem
A
itself.
high testimony when you consider the radiance. That it will look into the guiltiest swervings of the weaving heart and bear itself upon them, not flinching into disguise or darkening. When you consider the abundance of such resource as illuminates the glow blue bodies and gold skeined wings of...
If you notice right there, he gets much more intense with the line, which is very subtly hinted at in the line, but when he does it, it just makes sense. This is an important line.
Eyes swarming the dumped guts of the
If
natural
I had to
slaughter.
define the word entropy to a 5th grade classroom, I'd point at you.
Or the coil of shit.
Notice the shit right there. He doesn't shy away from it at all. He emphasizes it, which is what the poem is aiming for.
And in no way winces from its storms of generosity when you consider that air, or shale, snow, or vacuum, squid, or wolf, rose, or lichen,
Notice how each one of these items in this list, he's adding more and more emphasis to. Also, he changed the order. Now, this is something that should only be done with caution, but it is possible that when you're reading a poem out loud, it's much easier to say it a certain way or it sounds better. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you can portray it as intended, but perhaps a little bit off. However, there are other times when you do something like this, and the order might have a meaning. It might emphasize something. So, before you go and change anything about the poem you're reciting, you really have to go understand the whole poem. Understand what you think you should change, and figure out if it has any bearing on the rest of the poem. If it doesn't have a bearing and it makes the poem better by changing it, then go ahead. But otherwise, be very cautious about doing that. He obviously gets away with it because he knows what he's doing and he knows this poem like the back of his hand. But just be careful with that.
is accepted into as much light as it will take. Then the heart moves roomier. The man stands and looks about. The leaf does not increase itself above the grass, and the dark work of the deepest cell is of a tune with May bushes and fear.
Notice he makes a stop right there. May bushes and fear. He adds punctuation where there is none. And that's one of the things you have to learn how to do to be good.
It, by the breadth of such, calmly turns to praise.
So, next thing I'm going to be doing is going over the poem High Flight by John McGilpsky McGee Jr. He is an American pilot with the Royal Canadian Air Force during the time of the Second World War. He was killed at the age of 19 during a training accident in flight. This poem is written on many gravestones of pilots because of the way that it captures the feeling of flight and the essence of flight. So, you start out with In the first two lines, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and danced the skies on laughter silvered wings." Now, what you're doing here is with as emphasizing consonants and S sounds. "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and danced to the skies on laughter silvered wings." Now, why you're doing that is the poem does this to give you the feeling of flight, of sliding, moving, rushing, moving through things with very little resistance, which is flight. Just by the way he's using the words and the way you pronounce the words, you can give the impression or you can give the feeling of flight. Now, this method is you are attempting to show your interpretation of the poem to your audience. The other way you can do it is by just completely monotoning everything. Reading the poem exactly as it is done. If there is a comma, you stop, or honestly, I don't know this type very well. I have never done this type. I never intend to do this type of reading poetry. But it is important to note that this is one way that respectable-ish people recite poetry. So it might be appropriate for a different circumstance. So, back to what we were doing. "Sunward I've climbed, and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds." So, there's a rhythm here, especially of sun-split clouds. You can't just say, or you can, but I would prefer not to say sun-split clouds, of sun-split clouds. "Sunward I've climbed." So, with that, you're saying, "I've climbed." So, one of the things that's helpful to get your the point of the poem across is to change the tone and cadence of your voice with the poem. So, when it says, "Sunward I've climbed," you're saying, "We've gone up." So, when you're reading it, if you say, "Sunward I've climbed," it doesn't make sense. So you have to say, or you should, "Sunward I've climbed, and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds." I put a pause there because there's sort of a stop there. It's a change of ideas. Now, the next line is a complete different change of tone. You've gone from, "I'm describing what I've done. Sunward I've climbed, and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds." The next line, "and done 100 things you have not dreamed of." You've changed tones. You've changed from talking about something to talking to someone. You're bragging now. The tone here is, well, bragging isn't the right word, but you're implying a knowledge that someone else doesn't have. Even though you may not have it as a reader, you're implying that. So, it's really a remarkable change of pace. That's just one of the things that makes poetry what it is, that change of pace. "Sunward I've climbed, and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things you have not dreamed of." Then we go into listing what he's done. "Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence." That "swung high" right there is a great place to change the tone and cadence. Swung high is a very active, energetic phrase, so you can bring your tone and cadence up much higher than you would in the other sentence, in the other portions of this line. Also, wield and sword are both words that want to be said a certain way. Wield and sword and swung high in the sunlit silence. Now, sunlit silence is a difficult phrase to say because silence wants to be very quiet, but sunlit implies a warmth and happiness to it, which we don't usually associate with silence. So, saying that can be difficult, but you do it enough times, you can get a feel for it. I'm not claiming that I do, but I know enough to know that that's what needs to be done. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along, and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. So, hovering there is a very slow phrase. So, it's hovering there. I've chased the shouting wind along. So you're going from slow to fast, from just hovering to chasing and shouting. And you can't say that line just flat, or you shouldn't. Anytime I say can't, replace that with shouldn't. You probably could in the right scenario. Or if you're trying to convey the right thing. The next line, and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Now that is once again very much like the sunlit silence. It's another cool, empty, but welcoming feeling. Which is, again, fairly hard to difficult with just your voice. So, with these, another important thing to note is that you can't just read poetry sitting in a chair, standing completely still, or sitting completely still. Or, you could, but it wouldn't be nearly as good. Your facial expressions and the movements of your hands, and sometimes your entire body, can convey a really incredible amount of meaning, and can completely change the meaning of what you're saying if you're using your body right. So, use your hands. Channel your inner Italian. So, be active and be physically in the poem. Be interacting with the poem with your body and your face. If you do that, you're probably going to get the meaning you're trying to get across. Now, this next line is a very different one, because you could read it, up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue. However, that sounds wrong. Up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue is more how the line feels. These are all really intense words. The long, delirious, burning blue. And the up, up is really emphasizing a growing. Combine that with the long, you really need to stretch this line out. Or could. I do. And then it goes directly into the next one. So up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the wind-swept heights with easy grace. So you're crescendoing all the way through this sentence, up, up, all the way to I've topped, which tells you when you've reached the height of your crescendo. And then you can slowly go back to the wind-swept heights with easy grace, which is very similar to the beginning, where you're sounding like the wind. You've gone from this dramatic, climactic climb up, burning blue, and now you're sliding again in the wind. Up, up, the long, delirious, burning blue. I've topped the wind-swept great heights with easy grace, where never a lark or even eagle flew. And while, with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space. That line right there, or the word space, is another sort of isolated word. I don't think the high, untrespassed sanctity of space is quite as dramatic as the line feels like it wants. So giving space its own area in the sentence, giving it pause before it, the high, untrespassed sanctity of space. Then we go out to the next line, put out my hand and touched the face of God. There's another line that has this line here is sort of the climax of the poem. It's the finish. It's where everything ties together. This line is why he does what he does. And it's an incredibly powerful line, and one that needs a very light touch and an understanding of what he's being trying to say. And an understanding of what he's trying to say. So, to sum it up, read the poem, understand what's going on. If you have to, go line by line and try to figure out how the lines interact with each other. Figure out how the punctuation works. Sometimes it works one way, sometimes it works another way. Figure out how the lining works, whether or not there are lines where sentences go through lines or just stop at the end of the lines. This poem is each line ends and goes to a new thing. There aren't that many places where it keeps on going from line to line, which is very different from this one. On silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars. It's very different from that one. So, just have to be careful about reading the poem and figuring out how things work. Once you've figured out how the poem mechanically works, then you can go through and start figuring out, okay, how do I think I should make this line sound? You can do this by yourself, but another good thing, or another thing that can really help you, is doing it with someone. If you sit down and read it with them, don't expect to get it right the first time. Just read it out loud with them and ask them what they think. Ask them if they have any opinion. If you have someone who knows what they're doing, you can get some really good feedback. Even if you don't have someone who knows what they're doing at all, they can be very, very valuable just as sort of a wall to bounce ideas off of. Just ask, am I getting my point across? If you do that and you practice a lot, you'll get way better than I am. So, yeah. That is a very, very rudimentary overlook on reading poetry from someone who sort of, kind of, maybe knows what they're doing. Have a nice day.